Hello, we are here at the Sacramento History Museum in Old Sacramento in our print shop exhibit. We are going to talk today a little bit about newspapers. I've been continuing this series through our Facebook Lives over the last month talking about newspapers in California. First, I talked about the first newspapers in California, such as the Californian and the California Star. Talked about the Sacramento Union and the Sacramento Bee, other community papers, the first Chinese newspaper. I wanted to talk about a different subject today, and the big thing about newspapers in Sacramento is that Thompson and West's History of Sacramento, first published in 1880, they called Sacramento the graveyard of newspapers, about how Sacramento had so many, but they also failed as well. You'd have these printing offices, they'd get a press, they'd get all their type and everything, and then they'd realize just how hard it is to keep a newspaper going. And many of these printing offices even closed down before they even published one issue. Well, one of the things that comes out of this expansion of newspapers is they started to focus more on specific topics for specific communities. And in the early 1900s, community newspapers start to form in Sacramento, and by the 1950s, they become even more and more prominent. There's still community newspapers today. I still get Inside delivered to my home in Tahoe Park. But there were some other newspapers that started to spring up by the 1960s. And today I wanted to talk about a category of periodical that has grown since the 1970s, and that is LGBTQ plus newspapers. Now, obviously, when I'm talking about these newspapers, I'm not going to be talking about them using any equipment like this or anything like that. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about what kind of press would have been printing newspapers by this time in the 1970s. So while I will include a printing demonstration on our historic Washington hand press, it is not the kind of press that would have printed this sort of newspaper at this time. The first LGBT newspaper that was published in the United States was One Magazine in 1953. It was considered the first wide circulation gay periodical in North America. But in 1954, the U.S. Postal Service refused to deliver that periodical to homes. And it's actually One Magazine that actually took this issue to the Supreme Court, and through First Amendment rights, you started to see a lot of these more community newspapers delivered to homes nationwide. One of the first newspapers here in California that focused on the gay and lesbian community in the Bay Area was the Bay Area Reporter. It was first published April 1st, 1971. It is the oldest continuously published LGBTQ plus weekly newspaper in the United States, and you could actually access the archives for this newspaper through the California Digital Newspaper Collection. They cover the years 1971 to 2005. And if you're actually interested in other early California newspapers, I highly recommend going to the California Digital Newspaper Collection's website. They don't include the Sacramento Bee, but you could access the Sacramento Bee using your library card through the Sacramento Public Library. Now this paper and these other papers that I'm going to be talking about in just a little bit would have been printed on something like this. This is a model of a web press, and this is the kind of a web press that also the Sacramento Bee used for publishing newspapers by the 1970s. This web press while it might look small, is massive. I'm talking several stories tall, 80 feet long, and one of these rolls of paper would have had 5 miles of paper on it. And these papers, you'll see, if you've ever seen of a huge newspapers being published in the movies or anything like that, running through real fast operation on enormous cylinders, we're talking about the web press here. And that's also where you get the origin of stop the presses and stuff like that, except it was like incredibly hard to even stop the press on something like this because it's already constantly been running. And these are continuous rolls. The web press sometimes prints on both sides at the same time. Most web presses used several connected units for printing different colors of ink, and some had units for cutting, collating, folding, punching, all of that in a line so you have your finished newspaper at the end. And so this is what would have been printing newspapers I'm going to be talking about. And in 1977 in Sacramento, Gibeus Rising published, and I have a little picture here I have some of these examples of these newspapers, and I'm going to talk about these. You could even access these too. So this is Gibeus Rising, published in 1977 by Barbara Ward and Roxanne Mitchell. Now, Gay Sacramento was also published that same year. Now, a year later, Linda Berner established what became one of the most popular newspapers in the Sacramento LGBT community, and that was Mom Guess What? And these popular newspapers in Sacramento highlighted businesses, recreational activities, and nightlife that were accepting of the LGBT community. And these publications began to grow as the LGBT rights movement expanded over the years. In 1981, Mom Guess What was the first paper to publish a story on a gay wedding. The Sacramento Star and Patlar Gazette were published in 1982. In addition to talking about community events, these newspapers tackled issues facing the LGBT community. This is well beyond this idea of marriage or anything like that, but basic fundamental civil rights, such as not being fired because of one's sexual orientation, being able to adopt, and covering a wide variety of topics of discrimination. Of course, these papers became incredibly influential in educating the community in the onslaught of the HIV/AIDS epidemic that started in the 1980s. And we have here the Sacramento Star publishing on that very subject. Now, today, Sacramento's most prominent LGBT publication is Outward Magazine, published bi-monthly. But I haven't mentioned the first LGBT newspaper in Sacramento. The name of that newspaper I've set here on the press, and so I'm going to come around the other side here. So I've set the title of this newspaper in Caslon 72-point font. It's the largest metal type, one of the largest metal types that we have here in the shop. Now, this is our Washington hand press, manufactured in 1852 in Cincinnati, Ohio, by the Charles Foster and Brother Company. Now, I want to mention again, obviously, this style of hand press or anything like that would not have been printing this newspaper that first published in 1966. This newspaper began publication in February 1966 and ran until April 1967. The editor was David Clayton, and he was also the founder of Sacramento's first gay organization that has the same name. And so I'm going to print the title of this newspaper for you. I'm going to get some ink here from our ink stone with my brayer. Roll this across the top of the type. Get a little bit more here. Get some paper. Apply it to the top of the type. Put some padding here that helps protect the old type and all old press, and also helps make sure I print a more full image. Run the bed under the platen. We're pulling the devil's tail here. This lever activates the figure 4 toggle. It makes that impression, and that's why it's called a printing press. Lift up the tympan, remove our padding, and we have that paper, the Association for the Responsible Citizenship. This was the first newspaper here, LGBTQ plus newspaper here in Sacramento. Now this newspaper and other newspapers that I had mentioned today, these local Sacramento ones, you can research more through the Center for Sacramento History. They are the archives associated with our museum. And the Alan Chamberlain collection at the Center for Sacramento History has pretty much a comprehensive collection of these newspapers. And a lot of these newspapers were made possible by the Sacramento Bee. Mom Guess What was printed on the same web press that would have published the Sacramento Bee at this time in the 1980s. And you could also find out more information from the Lavender Library and Archives and Cultural Exchange on N and 21st Street. They are closed right now for renovations. They do have curbside pickup on Sundays, but they have a large collection as well on Sacramento's LGBTQ plus community. Thank you for joining me here at the Sacramento History Museum and being here with me through this month of March, where I've been highlighting newspapers here in Sacramento and in California history. Have a good one, everybody.